We've had, are we going? We've had, speakers on dolphins in years past. This is our first time, and we're pleased to have Randall Eaton with us to speak on the subject of whales. And you know, whales are just got a lot bigger brains than dolphins, and I think you're going to find it fascinating. You've probably, perhaps, heard him on the radio or at different times. I would like to say my title would be, What Are the Whales Telling Us? Because I think you're going to find it most interesting, fascinating to your own personal life. Welcome, Randall Eaton, will you, with us from Enterprise, Oregon today. Here. You're wired.
Can you hear me? No. Is this mic working? No.
A little more.
There. Can you hear me now? Yes. Okay. I believe that we are in a state of crisis, socially and environmentally. We have come to an improper relationship with one another, with the creatures, with the earth, and with the divine. At one time, I thought that crisis had its origin primarily in a change in philosophy. When the principle of uncertainty was formulated in the early part of the 20th century, it really signaled that Western scientific, mechanistically minded man had come to a dead end. He had come to realize that he couldn't predict with accuracy whether a nuclear phenomenon was a particle or a wave. All of a sudden, the queen of science, which was physics, faltered. All of a sudden, the great ego of Western man and his powerful intellect began to question itself in a serious way. What I'm telling you is that we've been in need of a new philosophy ever since that event. And I think we're in the process of formulating it now. And I think the men who formulated, gave us the answers, were all born in the generation of the 1880s. They included Aldo Leopold, the father of ecology. They included Carl Jung, who talked about the interdependence of the conscious mind and the unconscious. We've heard a lot about the unconscious in this conference so far. That too was a blow to Western intellectual, egotistical humanity. All of a sudden we had to recognize that there's something greater to the mind than the intellectual faculty. Pablo Picasso was one of the men of that generation. He took us back to primal art in the caves, reminded us of our roots and our original relationship with wild animals, which was one of a predator on the one hand and was a sacred one on the other. His cubism really reflects sacred geometry, the wholeness we were looking for and we're still looking for. Einstein, another man of that same generation, talked about the interdependence of time and space, which we, up till that time, thought were absolute and independent. And the greatest figure, in my mind, of that generation was none other than a Spanish philosopher named Jose Ortega y Gasset. He came along and said, Descartes said, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. You're only half right. It's true that consciousness is, Ortega says, it's true that consciousness is the least deniable reality in the universe, my own consciousness. However, he said, let us examine the content of our consciousness and see where that leads us. Well, he said, if you look at your own consciousness, you'll discover that your life is problematical at the core. Where am I going to go next? Should I buy this pair of shoes? Do I want to marry that person? Do I want this job? Should I head to the bank? Whatever it is. Living is problematical at the core. And based on that, Ortega said something very simple, but very, very profound. He said, my life consists of my ego in a mutually interdependent and transcendent relationship with my circumstances. In other words, my life does not consist merely of my ego. It consists of ego and world interdependently. Now you say, well, that's obvious. It is not obvious in terms of how we conduct our lives today. Do we treat other human beings with the same authenticity and value that we treat ourselves? No. We're still locked, pretty much, in egotistical thinking and living. Now, those men of the 1880s, in their different ways, all had one fundamental message: interdependence. Life is interdependence, ecologically, psychologically, philosophically, and so on. Now, it occurred to me today, for the first time, that really our crisis is not a philosophical crisis, because abstract concepts and philosophies are not going to win the day. That will not change our life. Our understanding that I just shared with you, you can understand or take as philosophy to the core, inside out and backwards, but it does not necessarily move you into a transcendent relationship with other humans, with other creatures, with the divine, with the earth. We are more fundamentally, at a more basic level, we are in a religious crisis. Remember, Joseph Campbell reminded us in his TV series that the word religion comes from the Latin word religio, which means to reunite with the source. If we are to lead interdependent lives in which we take responsibility for our circumstances, for the world, for other people, for other creatures, for the earth, then we must found it on something far more basic than philosophy. It must be something that we literally feel in our hearts. That is the transmutation which, as a species, is required of us at this time. Now, this is old stuff. Interdependence is ancient wisdom. The Aboriginal peoples have been knowing and living and walking that talk for as long as we know. Because it is the talk of the Creator they are walking. A Hopi Sun Chief once said, he was raised in a mission, he said, I have learned how to eat with a fork, use a toilet, sleep on a bed, recite the 10 Commandments, and I've also learned that man thinks with his head and not his heart. When the Ojibwe young men are initiated into adulthood, they go out into the wilderness for a year. They learn to think with their hearts. They come back, and their hearts are open. What kind of experiences are we now consciously offering our young people that open their hearts and get them connected to the earth, to one another? These are fundamental questions that we have to face. When they come back, they sing a prayer. Na nin de he. I sing from the heart. Na nin, na nin, na nin de he, hey yo, hey yo, hey yo, na ne, na nin, na nin, na nin de he, hey yo, hey yo, hey yo, ya ne. I sing, I sing, I sing from the heart. I sing, I sing, I sing from the heart. All the mythologies of the Western tradition warn us of the very condition we find ourselves in today. Beowulf, Gilgamesh, the oldest story we know, They all say the same thing. Odysseus. Beware, civilized man. Beware of vaulted pride. Beware of hubris. Do not forget your origins. Do not forget the green field from which you sprang. To do so, to quote Lauren Isley, is to invite disaster. When the native people pray, in all my experience, I'm one of the few PhDs that has been walking a medicine path. PhDs in science, anyway. They have a sacred phrase that means all my relations. That's how they translate it. And some of you have heard that. Some of you hopefully say it. When we pray, well, when we have Thanksgiving dinner, we say a prayer to God. But we don't bless the spirit of the turkey. You see? And that's the difference. Again, even our prayer comes from the intellect, so to speak. We don't thank the animal that actually gave its life to us. And when we drink a cup of water, do we bless the spirit of water? Some of us might even thank the Creator for that water because it is the blood of the earth. It gives us life. But how many of us, when we take a breath in the morning, thank the Creator not only for the air, but bless the spirit of the air because it has a spirit. It's alive. When they greet the morning sun, the Lakota people say, "Oh, matakwayasin." When the Puebla people offer their prayers and give their blessings in the morning, they say, "Say hano." Say hano. But whatever language they say it in, it means the same thing. I am related to all things. All things are my relatives. Why? Because we all have one Creator. So they acknowledge that at all times in their lives. I honestly believe that by whatever route we get there, we must recover open hearts that will connect us to the earth and to the Creator. Nothing else will do. Wonderful intellectual excursions aren't going to get the job done. Now, what does all this have to do with orca whales? Orca whales are the counterparts of humans in the seas. They rule that world, or did until very recently, till we usurped their position. They are the other superdominant species of the planet Earth. And in their own way, they have technology too. They can use sound in incredible ways in communication. These are giant dolphins now. These aren't really whales. These are giant dolphins. They opened my heart. They became my teachers and took me on a great path, and I want to share that with you now. I'd like to start by showing you the first few minutes of a video about orca whales, which we just released. I can figure it out. They're the dominant predators of the ocean world.
That's what the macaw whalers of the Pacific Northwest said about the orca. The highly aliens of the Queen Java Islands believes that the killer whale is the most powerful being in the world. An Indian in Nauru, British Columbia, felt likewise when he said that the orcas are like that. An Eskimo said that the orca is the soul of man. The Indian of Japan believed that the killer whale was the ruler of the deep sea. As Gary Snyder said, every culture that knows the orca feels the same about it.
spirit will be born of a baby killer whale. We will live the life of that killer whale, and when the killer whale dies, our spirit will be released to the everlasting potlatch, or our heaven. The Magana, you'll always see usually a human face incorporated into the design or the carving. And that symbolizing the afterlife of the hunters, the sea hunters in old, or in my belief, the hunters of nowadays. When we die, our spirits will be released and we will go into the domain of the life of the Magana for a short period. I'll go out with the dog and I'll interact with the whales. I'll get close to the boat and I'll sit there and I'll just talk to the whales as they pass.
Can you all hear that? Can we add some more volume?
And I go out there and see them and watch them swim under the boat, and every now and then maybe stick my hand out if they're close enough and touch them. It's just my way of interacting with some of the people in my family who have passed on in the last
Is that better?
years. From Leslie's car, our families, their first people, their origin tests are the Lagana, Telepathic. And those people, they took over being on Earth. The creator for the animals, mountains and trees on the great Earth. And then later on, weather of the Transformative came across the great land. And when he swept across the world, he transformed mountains, trees.
That's okay, Mark. I think we'll go on with the slides.
Into the first humans. And some of our families, they originated.
Well, I'm selling them here, and I'll be showing them. I'll give the premiere showing, the first premiere showing of these tapes in my workshop, if you want to come. The reason I turned this tape on, because I'll basically share with you, I wrote the script, so, you know, you've got the source right here, is I wanted you to see orcas moving in their world. To be in close to orca whales in the ocean is an incredible experience. You come within the aura of their field, and it can be life-changing. And if you're really lucky and you get in the water with them, as several people have done with us, and they zap you with sound, it opens up your heart like nothing I've ever experienced. I had one man come on the Orca project named Charles Baltzell. Some of you may know who he is. He's head of the River of Life thing. I see some heads shaking. He's been around the barn quite a bit, spiritually. He spent years working with Hawk John, a Cherokee medicine man. He worked with a yogi in India for years who teleports to wherever he is, you know, to talk with him for a few minutes and then disappears. And he said getting in the water with orca whales was the most profound experience of his life. They know what they're doing, and when they hit us with sound, it opens us up in ways that perhaps we had never experienced in our lives, and it can change our lives. I just wanted you to see how they move in the water. Much more dynamic than the slides will show. So, from a scientific perspective, I got to the point to where I developed certain grandiose theories about how we humans became the dominant life form on planet Earth. And it's a fascinating story. I don't have time for it today. But once we did become the dominant life form, and it's a very recent thing, not all peoples have even achieved it to this day. There are people to this day who live in dire fear of tigers. Now, we don't think about this much, but I suspect that becoming dominant to creatures like big bears and lions was the greatest single achievement in the history, the entire history of human life. Not the wheel, not getting to the moon, but dominating big predators. That's why the great culture heroes of every society known did the same thing. They killed an awesome beast. Hercules is a perfect example. That reflects those important events in our history. Once I got to the awareness that we had recently become a dominant creature on this planet, and we weren't always in this position, then I asked some questions. Why are we having such a hard time ruling this planet? Why are we not relating to one another in a better way? Why are we not treating this planet properly? And so I said, maybe there are some creatures out there who can teach us something. So I said, okay, there's the wolf that rules the whole Arctic regions. There's the lion that ruled even North America, actually, until a few thousand years ago. Until fairly recently, Europe, parts of Asia, and most of Africa. So let's look at the lion. Well, I spent years studying the lion, actually. And I said, then there's the orca whale and there's the human. So I began to compare grossly their behavior. And the orca whale was always standing out. Lions are always killing lions. Wolves kill wolves and intrude in their territories. Humans are always killing humans, unfortunately. But orcas don't kill one another. And there's no explanation why they don't. For all the rules that we've invented in behavioral science and ecology, they ought to kill each other. Once you become a dominant creature, your major enemy becomes other members of your species. That's why lions kill other lions. Their biggest enemies aren't hyenas and Cape hunting dogs. Okay? They're other lions. Orcas aren't killing one another. That was the first thing that said to me, whoa, something's going on here. Well, one night in 1976, I was at Jim Foster's house, a well-known veterinarian, worked on gorillas and so on. We were talking, and his son called up and said, hey, Dad, this is up in Seattle. Do you want to come down to the waterfront? We're loading up these 2 orca whales that we just captured from Puget Sound. They had been captured for SeaWorld Park. But the people in the community of Seattle and so on protested so vehemently that finally there was a federal judge who declared that these whales will get returned to Puget Sound. And they declared Puget Sound a marine mammal sanctuary and so on. The 2 whales that were going to get shipped out to some SeaWorld Park someplace were going to get put back in the sea. But the judge did also say that a colleague of mine at the University of Washington could take those animals and study them for a while and then release them with radio so we could track them. Well, I went down to the waterfront. And what I saw is, this was later than the waterfront, but the same boat was used. You see this contraption here? That's holding an orca. There's a huge canvas sheet underneath it. And they can raise it up and down with a cable for the hoist on the boat. I was down at this waterfront aquarium. And I thought to myself, how do you get a 7-ton, full-grown, totally wild, this animal's only been in a small pool in captivity for a few days, how do you get an animal like that to go into that little apparatus so you can lift it up out of the water and move it? I mean, think about it. How do you do that? Would you do it with a wild elephant? Not one you raised from the time it was 3 or 4 years old, but totally wild? I don't know how. You certainly wouldn't have an easy time doing it with a lion. Well, after they lowered that hoist down, they laid that canvas out, and these men are walking around in front of their mouths the whole time, and I'm thinking, God, this is really strange. This is a totally wild animal. Why are these men safe? They're walking a few inches from her jaws. I've been studying big carnivores for years, and I'm going, this animal doesn't behave anything like other big predators that I've known. So anyway, they lifted her up out of the water. The cable broke. And she fell down in the pool, and the water was very shallow at that point. She hit her stomach on the bottom of the pool, and no doubt it harmed her. And so I thought, well, now how are they going to get her in that contraption and lift her up again so they can get her on that boat and take her up to this island? Within 30 minutes, she again swam into that chute on her own, and they wrapped her up, and they lifted her up out of the water. The only way that could happen is if she understood what we wanted her to do, first of all, and secondly, was willing to go along with it despite the trauma we had just put her through. So I got pretty excited on watching all this, and I immediately volunteered to the scientist in charge. Said, I want to be the behaviorist in this project. Is that okay with you? Sure. So the next morning I was there when they brought her. Now this is not something that's unique, this occurrence of a human diver in the water handling an orca whale. That in itself is a mystery. I'm telling you, scientifically, we don't understand how that's even possible. If you talk to anybody with the kind of credentials I have, who hasn't studied these creatures, and say, well, can you take a wild predator and handle it, you know, within an hour after you capture it? Of course not, they'll tell you. That's a wild animal. It hasn't been socialized to people. It's not tame. You can't touch it. But you see it happening right there. And it happened every time they captured orca whales over a period of 10 years in Puget Sound. Every single orca they captured, which is the source of all the orcas that went to all the aquariums in the world from 65 to 75, they all came out of Puget Sound. Well, the head diver, who's an Athabascan Indian, took movies of every one of those captures, and I sat and watched them with him. And I saw not only was it difficult to capture an orca, it cost maybe $500,000 to capture one back in those days. You had to use boats, planes dropping bombs, driving them into bays, netting off the bays, and then pursing them up in a net. And when that happens, they try their best to get away. Some of them do. Some of them stay within the net. If there's one thing orcas are frightened of, it's nets, because nets can drown them. And I saw these men, 200-pound men, dive in the water, swim over to an orca whale that's doing its best to escape the small net, put his hand on its dorsal fin, and guide it into a steel capture cage. Imagine that. This is a totally wild animal. It's doing its best to escape, wants to join its family. And a puny human being takes it and moves it into a capture cage. Well, guess what happened with some of those whales at that point? It gets more interesting. Some of the whales at that point let their air out and sink to the bottom of that capture cage and die. They hadn't raised a fluke against a human being. They hadn't opened their jaws to warn them and say, stay away from me. When the human guided them in that capture cage, they cooperated, but some of them obviously made the decision, I'm not going. They let out their air and they died. Others went along, and they occupied aquariums around the world. What I'm telling you is, and I don't have time to present all the evidence here, I'm absolutely convinced from strictly scientific point of view that the orcas that came into our world did so willingly, consciously, and deliberately. Namu, the first orca ever captured. It's an amazing story. It's all written in Ted Griffin's book. Namu came along when they'd already captured a calf orca. This was going to be the first one to be in an aquarium ever, back in '65. Ted Griffin was on his way from Seattle up to Namu, British Columbia to get that baby orca. It was going to be his prize, his trophy. He wanted to do this all his life. But this great big bull orca that we ended up calling Namu swam up to that net, swam into it, and guided the baby out of the net. Why did he guide the baby out of the net and stay inside the net? He knew how to get out. He showed the baby how to get out of the net. He stayed there. During the night, the net went down with the tide, and it got stuck on the rocks, which meant that for a whole tidal cycle, that bull orca, full-grown male orca whale, was free to leave, and it stayed there. When Ted arrived in the morning, he said, well, they told him what happened. And he said, well, how'd you keep him here? And they said, Ted, we talked to him. Now, I'm not saying, and it may be true that it was because they talked to him. What I'm saying is, whether or not that's what kept him there, the point is he stayed there when he could have left. Now, after they drug him down to Seattle in this huge contraption, this sort of floating net, they kept him in Bud Inlet across the bay. Twice, big logs came through the net, and Namu swam out into Puget Sound, and on his own returned back into captivity while they repaired the net. So I'm asking you, who captured whom? You see? When you look at this kind of evidence, you're going, now wait a minute, this is a totally different kind of relationship that's going on between us and these creatures than we have conducted with others for the most part. So during this first month that I was with the orca whales, and it turns out that these are the so-called transient type. There's the coastal variety, which eats only fish. There's the transient type, the migratory type, which eats marine mammals and fish. According to genetic studies, they haven't interbred, even though they're living side by side. These two types of orcas haven't interbred for 100,000 years. It's some kind of Cain and Abel story. There is an incredible difference here in their lifestyle. Well, these are the transient types. They could have easily eaten that man. Orcas can easily jump up on a beach and grab a sea lion and pull it back in. They have that capability. They can capture ducks in flight. Start trying to figure out the physics of that. A 7-ton animal catching a 3-pound duck flying 35 miles an hour above the water. Well, while I was here, about 2 weeks after the study started, I was noting all the behavior and listening to their sounds and so on. The first day came along when I was all alone out there. There were no sheriff's deputies, there were no news people, there were no U.S. Marine Fisheries Service people and all that stuff. And I was sitting on a rock taking notes, and the orcas came around, and they rolled on their sides. They got their eyes out of the water, which I'd never seen them do. They went by me so slow I could barely see them moving, one after the other. They looked me right in the eye. I thought, well, this is really strange. They were only about 7 feet away. And they gave me a telepathic message. I'd never taken acid. I'd never read a John Lilly book, you know. I mean, being a hardcore straight-nosed scientist at that point in time, why would I even open a John Lilly book? You see what I'm saying? Well, the message was very simple. We know what you're doing, and it's okay. That was it. But it was enough for me to fall over like this on the ground. God, you know, what happened here? What happened? And I couldn't deny it, though, and it changed my life. And it was the beginning of the sense that I had to do everything I could to learn as much as I could about these creatures. And we started an Orca society. We had 5,000 members within a matter of weeks. We published a beautiful full-color magazine about them. Got involved with the international politics of whale conservation and the whole business. But as things developed, I took on a new attitude towards the orca whales. And it was all the things that they continued to show me. The day came when this one male orca, who looks a little like Keiko because his fin's bent over, it was time for them to run him up on shore and put his radio transmitter on his fin. These men that you see back there decided, well, the best way to do this is to get in the water and swim toward him with a net between us, because orcas are afraid of nets, and if we do that, well, it'll drive him up on the shore. Before they got in the water, that orca swam up on shore. He stranded himself. He wasn't frightened on the shore. He knew what they wanted him to do. Now realize, stranding yourself when you're an orca could be pretty risky. You just may not get off that beach. It's a very shallow beach. It's not like jumping out on a cliff where you can wriggle a little bit and get back in the water. It's a very gradual beach. So he ended up, there he is, stranded. Now this is a youngster. He's an adolescent. He's not real big, but he still weighs several tons, and he's got very big teeth. During this entire manipulation, during which they put needles as big as my small finger into his body to extract tissue samples to warrant some publication in some scientific journal. They also drilled holes through his dorsal fin to attach a radio transmitter. He cried, he screamed, literally screamed, and we recorded the sounds and played them back to people who were naive, who didn't know where the sounds came from. And we'd say to them, what sound is this? Do you know what that is? They'd say, well, it sounds like a person screaming. And we said, yeah, it certainly does. Well, it wasn't. It was an orca whale. The only time we've ever heard them made those sounds. But here's what's significant to me as an animal behaviorist. That orca didn't open its jaws. It didn't bite at those men. It didn't strike out them when it could have easily. An orca can kill and swallow 6 sea lions in one meal. We raise lots of animals, and I've raised a great number of them myself. And they will be tame if we do that. I've raised lots of big cats. I studied them for 10 years around the world. But with the orcas, again, it's a mystery, scientifically. And with the dolphins, too, that they would be tamed to us. And the same thing's going on with the gray whales down in Baja. People go out and pet those animals. Those animals come up to people in boats, and they reach out and they touch them. And isn't it beautiful that that defies science altogether? Isn't it great that we have other creatures on this planet who really have the same consciousness as we do, who will go out of their way to make friends with us the way we'd like to make friends with them? Isn't that beautiful? So the first day we went to an aquarium with some students was in '79. And when we were walking in, one of the students, Candy Carrier from Evergreen State College, said, do you think that humans can communicate with animals telepathically? Well, I'd already had that experience with the orcas and had lots of other similar experiences, but I knew their training. I knew how they were being indoctrinated. Science is a priesthood. It's a mythology that, believe it or not, governs much of our thought to this day, and we're not even conscious of it. But I didn't want to bias their point of view. I said, let's test it. That's the obvious thing to do, isn't it? Let's find out. So we did a little experiment. There were 5 of us all together. We all sat down here. We'd never fed this orca, any of us. It was our first time with that orca whale. I said, here's what we'll do. Each one of us will walk to the opposite side of the pool, sit down, in a half lotus position, close our eyes, and count silently to 100. And then stand up and come back. First student did it. The whale stayed over here with the rest of us. Second student did it. The whale stayed here again. I was third, but I cheated. When I went across, I didn't count silently in my mind to 100. What I did is I immediately said, Scanna, quietly now in my mind, Scanna, if you hear me, come to me now. Within 3 seconds, and this has all been filmed, there's a picture of it in my book. There was Scanna all the way across the pool with her head out of the water pointed right at my third eye, about that far away. I heard the water dripping off her face and I opened my eyes. There she was. I came back and the student said, what'd you do? How'd that happen? And I said, well, we got to finish the trial here. So the fourth one went over, nothing happened, fifth one went over, and then I told them what I had done. That was enough to crack a hole in the edifice of their scientific indoctrination. So I know to this day that they will have somewhat of an open mind about what is possible. I had been studying orcas for several years, and I was heading back by the Vancouver Aquarium, where that last picture was taken, and I hadn't seen any orcas in captivity for several years. Orcas have done wonders for the orca nation by being in captivity, don't mistake me. Orcas in captivity have probably done more for the oceans and the life of the oceans than everything else combined. They're the most popular creature on the planet Earth today. In 1965, we were killing them for $50 bounty in Washington State. You talk about a Cinderella story, there it is. The student I was with, Susan Sprague, says, I really want to see an orca in the eye. She had an uncanny ability to attract orcas to her in the wild. And I said, okay, we'll stop, and you can go in and look at one of the orcas in the aquarium. We had a field site up in northern BC. We're going to get supplies. So she got out of the car, and I thought, well, I better go. Something just said I better go. So I walked in there ahead of her. When I got there, this is what I saw. This young male Hayak. He's older now. He's lived in captivity today longer than any orca ever has. He was at the window. Something guided me. I'd never interacted with this animal. I didn't really know him. I'd only seen him a couple of times. He used to live with Scanna, who had died. And I walked up and I put my hands on the glass and placed my forehead against it at my chest. And we were in instant communion. I told him in my heart that I was sad that Scanna had died. I could feel his pain, and he was very much in pain. He was very lonely. He was living all alone. One of the most social creatures, or the most stable society known on Earth, is living in a huge bathtub, entertaining people by the thousands day in and day out, with no other orca to touch or communicate with. Tears were streaming down my face. I could feel his pain. People would walk by and make silly comments. They could feel what was happening, but they sort of resisted it. One little boy said, he wants to kiss you. And I turned, it was the only time I turned away. And I looked at him and I said, yes, yes he does. There was a moment when I imagined caressing that orca whale. And I saw his body undulate in perfect synchrony with my imaginary caress. The stories about dolphins that we've heard have been put down by a lot of scientists in the field. They don't want to accept what goes against the doctrines that they've acquired. And yet, the facts speak for themselves around the world, throughout time. All the literatures known of all the sea peoples record that dolphins have gone out of their way to make friends with human beings, to save human beings, and so on. Beaky was a very well-known dolphin in the south of England who went out of his way to befriend human beings. He'd been shot. That's actually a bullet hole scar right here. He'd been shot in the head and somehow survived that. That's his eye, and that's his blowhole. But I've checked into it and I've studied it in depth. It's totally valid, authentic stuff. And that in itself, of course, is totally unexpected from a scientific point of view. Why do these creatures go out of their way to make friends with us? What do they hope to achieve? Why do they bother? You tell the Dutch pilot whose plane crashed in the Indian Ocean and a female dolphin pushed his little rubber raft ashore for 5 days to save his life. That these creatures don't consciously and deliberately know what they're doing when they save a human life. Some scientists have pretended, oh, they have some blind instinct to get rid of foul things in their world, so they push them to shore. I said, well, if that's true, why don't they push all that other garbage to shore that we put in the sea, you know? We don't see them doing that. So he would give young people free rides, and they enjoyed it tremendously. Now, if we want to look at brains and compare them in a very gross way, we can make some assumptions. We can say, for example, that the relationship between brain size and body size doesn't have to be strictly linear, meaning that as bodies increase, brains don't have to necessarily increase proportionately in order to operate that body. It can take less brain to operate a bigger and bigger body. That's what this relationship basically says or assumes. And you can see that the creatures on this curve, by this particular measure, the biggest brain creatures on this earth include the dolphins, the human, the beluga, the orca, which is second, actually. The elephant's very high, not just in absolute brain size, but in relative brain size using this measure. And the sperm whale. And I worked with elephants, by the way. I'll share some of that with you in the workshop, and had wonderful, wonderful experiences with these creatures. So the orca is very advanced. Now you look at the brain of a human, a dolphin, and some other mammals, and you see this is a pretty impressive brain. You know, there was a time in the 50s when I read a book in high school that basically stated, you know, the human brain is the most advanced organ ever to evolve in the history of the universe. You know, that kind of a statement, you know. That you could take the neurons and link them end to end, I'll never forget this, and they would stretch all the way from Earth to the moon. Wow. Billions of neurons. Well, that's an impressive brain, and by just about any measure that scientists can use, whether it's the thickness of the cortex, the packing of neurons per cubic area, whatever it is. There's also some differences. And that is incredible cerebellum development, the Center for Coordination. Of course, they're living all the time in this, you know, water world. They're sort of flying through a water world all the time. And they even adjust the pressures in their body to the pressures of the water. A dolphin can change the tonicity of the skin to accommodate increasing pressures of water instantaneously on its body. The scientists tried to duplicate that in the military arena so that they could have submarines that would move with less resistance, and they never could do it, of course. And they also have huge lateral development in the auditory hemisphere of the brain, which indicates, of course, that sound is very important to them. Now, how do these creatures communicate? Well, I applied the concept of onomatopoeia. Do you remember that? You had to learn to spell it in the 6th grade. Meaning basically that we started using speech by imitating the sounds made by other creatures or things. So that if you wanted to talk about lions, you might go, and point over there. There's a lion over there, you know. Or if you were in the northern areas, you would say, woof, woof, for a wolf. The word wolf comes from the sound woof, made by a wolf. That's the whole idea of onomatopoeia. Well, the root of lion is l, la, la. L-U with an umlaut, la. And that's the sound that lions make when they roar. So I said, what if these creatures have evolved a communication system based upon sonar, which is their primary mode monitoring their world? They send out sounds, they get echoes back, and those give them mental images. Now, they would want to communicate via sound, which is the best medium both for monitoring your world underwater. After all, sound moves 3.5 times faster in water than it does in air. And you can see in total, quote, see in total darkness using sonar. You would want to communicate about your perceptions underwater, about where the salmon are, or the danger is, or whatever, in a way that could be understood by one another. How would that evolve? My theory is that the orcas and dolphins use abbreviated sound based upon the sound echoes that they receive from their sonar emissions. So that they get an echo back from a salmon. They take some version of that echo and communicate it to one another. And that stands for salmon. Now, the other trick about sonar that you need to understand before you can really appreciate what's going on here is that sonar is like X-ray vision. Sonar passes through bodies just the way it does water. Water and bodies are the same density. So when a dolphin and an orca uses sonar, they literally can see through one another. And we know from experimental studies that that is so. We know that dolphins can learn to discriminate two identical brass balls that have different hollow sizes of hollow centers. The one with a little bit bigger center can be discriminated from the one that's a little bit smaller. Otherwise, the balls are identical. They literally are able to use sonar to, quote, see through those balls and tell the difference between them. If that is so, then it means that they live in totally honest societies. Why do I say that? Well, we live in very much a dishonest society. How you doing today, Dean? Dean says, doing great. All right? Dean really doesn't feel very good. He's got some indigestion, and he was up too late last night talking to some people, and so on. How many times a day do we actually lie to one another? Well, not that we have bad intentions. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that we really aren't very honest. And that's because we rely upon light to assess one another. Light is reflected off our bodies. Sound reflection works the same way, basically. And that's what we're using to communicate. That means that we're going on superficial images. When light reflects off an object, you don't get to see what's going on inside it. But if you have sonar, you can literally look through it, which means that an orca or a dolphin can assess another orca or dolphin's state of being. Blood pressure, tonicity of the muscles, how are the organs doing, everything that, all the physiological parameters that have psychological and emotional counterparts can be instantly assessed. Bingo. I know exactly how this orca feels at this point in time. Well, to appreciate their communication system, try to understand that they can do what Superman does, and then some. They not only can see through things, rather than just these superficial reflections that we get visually, but they can also communicate about those X-ray kinds of perceptions. It'd be the same as Superman not only using X-ray vision, but then being able to turn and look into Superwoman's eyes and transmit whatever he's just seen in an X-ray kind of way directly into her eyes. That's what they're doing with sound. We see superficial images, reflections of light, and then we try to talk about it in a different modality. And we know the picture's worth 1,000 words, because this does not begin to even come close to what we can see in terms of reflection of light. Now imagine you not only could see through other things, but you could turn and transmit that information visually to one another. I believe that that's what they're achieving with sounds all the time. I think they're using holographic sound communication. Now the orcas communicate over a band of 250,000 cycles. What a range of frequency. Dolphins up to maybe 125,000. Why do they need all that? We only go up to 20 or 25, right? Because, according to the physics of acoustics, they must be transmitting enormous amounts of information instantaneously. Sound pictures. Very, very efficient form of communication. If they're doing what I think they're doing, it's the most efficient communication system that we know of in the universe. These baby orcas are getting taught how to feed upon a great whale. The adults are holding it still in the water. There's a cow on the front pectoral fin on each side, so there's an adult cow holding this whale this way so it can't move. There's two big bull orcas holding the fluke, the tail, and they all grabbed it simultaneously. At the same moment, boom, They held that baby blue whale still in the water. The babies are now coming in taking bites out of its body. This is a lesson in how to eat a great whale. In the whaling days, it was commonly observed that orcas would hold, these are the transient orcas now, the marine mammal killing orcas, who also are friendly to us. They would hold a whale still in the water, and then one of them would jump up and lay on its blowhole. You see, the hardest problem you have if you're an orca attacking a great whale is killing it, because its body is so very big. It's hard to wound it. So one would lay in its blowhole to suffocate it. Imagine that. 4 orcas holding it still while a 5th one lays on its blowhole to prevent it from breathing. You think they don't know what they're doing? Now, for those of you who are interested in ETs, and I think many of you are, you really need to know what happened in the Johnstone Straits in northern British Columbia in the early 1970s. You all know the theme of encounters of the third kind. You're all familiar with NASA's ideas about broadcasting the radio frequency of hydrogen into outer space under the belief that if intelligent beings out there hear that frequency, they'll know that some intelligent being must have broadcasted it to them, and therefore they'll send something back that tells us, yeah, we want to communicate with you. You all know that. A guy named Eric Hoyt was the sound engineer in a project. They made a small documentary about orca whales. He kept listening underwater, and he'd hear the orcas go, probably the most common sound that he would hear underwater. Now, this is not, they do not use linear communication, as I've been trying to tell you. It's not speech, which goes on second after second, and that's how you figure out what I'm trying to say. When they make that sound, it's also being made all the way up to 250,000 cycles per second, way, way far above what we can hear. But he did his best on a synthesizer on board the boat to imitate that sound. And even to the human ear, the people on board could tell the difference between what they were hearing the orcas do, that whistle sound, and the synthesizer sound that they made to imitate it. Furthermore, the synthesizer didn't go above about 20,000 cycles per second, when in fact the orca sound went all the way up, say to 250. The first time Eric Hoyt broadcast that sound underwater, the orcas responded by swimming to the boat and making a perfect imitation of his imitation. Yeah. Now that's significant. That's very significant. Do we have extraterrestrial intelligent life here on planet Earth? You bet we do. That's a confirmation of exactly what NASA's been looking for. And when I wrote a letter to Science, where I have published, you know, the Science magazine, the journal, they sent back my comments about this discovery with no comments whatsoever. It's an amazing thing that orcas will help dolphins in captivity. Once they're placed together, some of their pool mates may only be other species, and the level of cooperation that occurs there is quite remarkable. It may look like Scanna's about to eat White Wing, who's a Pacific white-sided dolphin, when in point of fact she's waiting for her baby to be born. The moment it was born, right after this picture was taken, Scanna lifted that baby to the surface of the water so it could take its first breath. Exactly what another mother dolphin would have done had there been one present. Now, the most incredible things happen unexpectedly, as you well know. And while we were at the Vancouver Aquarium studying orca behavior, we discovered a talking whale, a beluga whale. You remember that one chart I showed you? Showed the brain size comparisons? The beluga was really above the scale, if you noticed. The beluga was the largest of all, brain to body size, using that relationship. This beluga whale was saying his name to people day in and day out. Hundreds of people, thousands over several years. And many of us in this field who'd hoped to establish interspecies communication with some kind of cetacean suddenly came upon a creature that was attempting to communicate with us. Now, I can't tell you for sure that he was using human speech. I can tell you for sure he was imitating human speech. But there were many aspects to his behavior that suggested that it was more than simply imitating human speech. He was saying Lugosi. Now, how does a beluga whale say Lugosi? They don't have vocal cords. They don't transmit sound through their mouths. They make sound through a complex process of forcing air through sinuses in the forehead. And then that sound can be transmitted either down the jaws or out of the head itself. But while he would transmit that sound through the glass so you could hear it with your ear, he would move his jaws up and down. See? Yeah. And then after he would do that for a while, he would stop making the sounds, he would stop moving his jaws, and he would place his ear, he doesn't have an ear, he placed the side of his head against the glass. And he'd watch you, and he'd wait for you to talk to him. Isn't that something? I mean, in every way he was imitating every aspect as best he could of all the behaviors and gestures that we use when we communicate. Well, some animal magazine heard about it and published some hot story about science discovers talking whale, you know. And I said, no, wait a minute, we didn't say he was talking. We said he was imitating human speech. And so then the curator at the Vancouver Aquarium got very upset. He said, no animal is capable of possibly communicating with language, and so on and so forth. And then he even got into an argument with us on whether or not the sounds made by that particular whale resembled Russian or Chinese. He thought they resembled Chinese. We thought they sounded Russian. But anyway, they ousted us from the aquarium because our ideas were so radical, you know. There he is. Now he's sending sound, see? Now he's got his forehead against the glass, and he's looking in the eye, and he's moving his jaws, and he's sending the sound. Lugosi, Lugosi. Time's up. Oh, Lord. Okay. I'll just show you a few more pictures and get off. You can't take up your wife's time. You can take other speakers' time, but not your wife. Anyway, the orcas, I just want to share one more thing, Kathy, with these people. And Kathy was there with me this summer. Summer of '95. Was the last year I spent with orcas. I spent 20 wonderful summers with them. And I saw people's lives transformed by being out with the orca whales, living in the wilderness, catching fish. I believe that when we participate in the food chain, we develop a sacred sense about life. So taking people out in the wilderness, letting them fish for their food, cooperate together, become a little Paleolithic tribe was transformative for lots of people. It's a formula, really, for what we need to recover thinking with the heart. But the last thing the orcas told me was very simple. They said, it's time for you to go out and start teaching your brothers and sisters that life is sacred and to honor it. Thank you.
To see that you could see that.
Where'd you get that?
And probably it would be much better if one of these lights were off.
Oh, really? Oh, that's cute. Is that a
They were at the table.
reptilian?
Okay.
The boy was watching the stuff at the table,
Here's
so
Dr. Eaton
all they
again.
did was quickly drew this little thing, Drake's.
Your microphone's still on. I guess I can use this one. Can you hear me off this one? Is it? Okay. Maybe I can do it like this. It occurred to me yesterday after I got off the stage that I hadn't told you some of the most important things about orca whales. A lot of times I sort of wax philosophical, as you noticed. Now what I wanted to share with you is that not only do they not make war in their own kind, and believe me, biologically that's a great mystery and a wonderful attribute of those creatures, but females govern orca societies, even though males are significantly larger than, females are significantly larger than males. In lions, we have males who are, 25–30% larger than females. You would expect what happens. Males govern females. Human males physically dominate human females if they don't dominate them in other ways, and so on. But in this interesting species, females are smaller, and yet they govern orca societies. We hear a lot about matriarchal societies among humans and among animals. In point of fact, there are no true matriarchal societies, except for the orca whale, among mammals. They have something probably closer to the social insects than anything else that lives on the planet. We talk about elephants being matriarchal, but they really aren't. There are bull herds, there are solitary bulls that don't mix with the female groups. We hear about matriarchal human societies, but they really aren't. They aren't totally and completely governed by females. In the orca society, it is an absolute true matriarchy. What's interesting about this society is that the males, the ones with the big tall fins like Namu, the males that get to be 7 and 8 tons in weight, maybe 25 feet long with dorsal fins as tall as I am, are actually the sons of the females in those orca groups, and they spend their entire lifetimes helping their mothers raise young. They do leave their groups to go mate with females in other societies, but only when they're called to do so. It's not as though all the males in orca land are competing for a female when she's receptive. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't work the way it does with dogs, for example. It seems, based on the work of Dr. John Ford in northern British Columbia, where I worked a lot with orcas, as you see right here, that when a female is receptive, the female members of her group will basically invite a particular male from another orca society to come and mate with that particular female. Copulation occurs a few times. She's inseminated and she has a baby. This is quite unlike dolphins. Even though orcas are giant dolphins, their behavior when it comes to reproduction is very different than, say, bottlenose dolphins. Bottlenose dolphins copulate, well, they have the record of all the creatures on the planet. They can copulate hundreds of times in a day. Lions may copulate 100 times in a day, and the same is true for tigers. Humans actually are one of the sexiest creatures because we even have sex when there's not a need to reproduce. Anyway, the orca stands out in other ways. I mentioned to you that at least as of 1956, they haven't overtly attacked human beings even during capture. I don't think I shared with you the history of their interaction and relationship with the native peoples of the North Pacific. Did I mention that? Okay. What's fascinating about the mythologies and legends of the people, from the Macaw to the Haida to the Kwakiutl to the Inuit of Alaska, and even around to the Ainu of northern Japan, is that they tell a story that's never been told by any humans in the history of the earth about their relationship with big predators in their world. How many of you saw Ghost in the Darkness, the film about the lions? Okay? That's based upon actual events. It's distorted, but there was really a Mombasa railroad that was built in the early part of the last century, and there were hundreds of coolies who were killed by 2 male lions. A single leopard has been known to wipe out villages of as many as 200 people in Africa or Asia. That's the kind of history of relationship that we've had with big predators on planet Earth. We don't relate to it much today because, as I said earlier, we've dominated them. We've destroyed all the lions in Europe. But the history of that relationship is symbolized by the fact that those countries still have lions as their national symbol. When we get to the people who have lived with the orcas intimately for thousands of years, side by side, day in and day out, fishing in the same waters, hunting the same species, whether they're catching salmon, whether they're hunting marine mammals, whether they're killing great whales. All those people have a common storyline. There's slight variations, but here's the way the story goes. There was a time in the history of our people when we attacked orcas. They had never attacked us prior to that. That is not what we hear about people who lived with lions, with great bears, and so on around the world, or jaguars in Mesoamerica, or tigers in Asia. Up to the time that we attacked them first, they never attacked us. Why not? You've got these puny humans in these walrus skin boats paddling around with their harpoons, and they're killing the same species that you're killing and eating. They might even be dangerous to you or your young, potentially. So why would orcas never attack human beings? Well, this is what they all say. Then they say something even more interesting to me. They say this: the orcas attacked us back, but they only attacked those members of our society who had actually attacked them. Not anybody, but only the culprits. And to this day in Alaska, there is a man who did kill an orca whale. It's taboo among the Eskimos in Alaska, but he did it anyway. And he dragged the body to shore, and all the people in the village, he's still alive in Barrow, they said, "You'll never be able to go to sea again." Every time he has come down to the sea, the people in the village all say to this day, the orcas have surfaced offshore. Every time he has come down to the water, they have shown up. This is their testimony. And he's never gone back to the sea. So, and then it gets even more elegant, in my opinion. Then they say, we have had peace with orca whales ever since. That's the typical storyline. They didn't attack us, we attacked them, they attacked the culprits back, and everything's been fine since. That implies, now I give a lot of credit to what Aboriginal peoples have to say, particularly hunting peoples, about their relationship with wild animals. Why? Well, first of all, we know, based on scientific studies and based on their mythologies and their own common sense knowledge, that they have a very accurate assessment of the behavior of the creatures in their world. And wouldn't you expect that? Of course. It's not like agricultural peoples who get all kinds of superstition about the creatures in their world and about the forces of nature. Hunting peoples have a very, very practical, accurate knowledge of the creatures in their world. Their lives depend upon having that knowledge and passing it on in a very accurate manner from generation to generation. So when they tell me they've had peace ever since, I believe them. It implies that orca whales have a system of justice in relationship to us, another species, which exceeds, for the most part, our justice system in relationship to our own species. How often, when members of another society attack our society, do we go after only the culprits? We'll wipe out as many as we can. We'll teach them a lesson. Isn't that our mentality generally? It is. But we're talking here not about the same species. We're talking about different species. During our lunch yesterday, Harry asked me, what's going on here? I honestly believe, and I don't have the time, even though I'm fortunate enough to get back up again, to tell you all the reasons and very clear scientific, deductive evidence about why I believe this. I believe that orcas and dolphins know that we're on the same plane of soul evolution that they are. They perceive us, despite all the differences in our appearances, as brothers on a very deep level. And I believe that is why dolphins have gone out of their way for thousands of years to befriend us and to save people at sea. And the Kwakiutls of British Columbia, the Indians there, say orcas have saved them at sea also. It's not unique just to dolphins. With that, I'd like to go on with my travel log. We started working in northern British Columbia in the early 80s. Prior to that, we had worked in the San Juan Islands of Puget Sound. There are two different populations in these areas, and those populations are the best known orcas in the world. The best orca land really is Iceland, where there's probably 5,000 orcas living around that small island country. There's a few hundred that live in the entire northwest region. We set up a wilderness camp, and I mentioned to you as I closed yesterday that taking people into the wilderness, letting them work together and form a Paleolithic tribe, where we severed all connections with artificial society and civilization, has the most profound influence that I've ever witnessed in transformation of individuals. People begin to lighten up, they begin to shine in their hearts, they begin to cooperate willingly with one another, being close to the earth, sleeping on the ground, being in the midst of eagles and dolphins and orcas and bears and wolves, and having a common purpose is an incredible experience. I've seen everything that I could ever hope to happen in a week's time to people on these trips. I honestly feel that wilderness goes a long way in reconnecting us with the earth and with the creatures and with one another and with the divine. And I didn't expect that when I started the study. I started it simply as a scientific endeavor to learn more about orca whales. And while we did that over time, I discovered in the process of it that the people, the volunteers who were coming to help us do this project, were getting a true education, the kind of education that we civilized people sorely need. We set up an observation post. People had a lot of fun playing Huck Finn, building their own tin enclosures along the water. We'd go out in boats and learn to identify the individual orcas. You really can't understand much about their social life if you're not able to understand and recognize the different individuals within those groups. And we did that by taking photographs of them and identifying unique characteristics of each individual. Kayaking with orcas is a great fun thing to do, and especially going out at night with them on the water is really spectacular. There's a phosphorescent algae in that water, in the summer times at least, and when you go out at night and an orca passes anywhere near you, there's light everywhere, and its body is literally totally lit up underwater. And you can see it, and it's beautiful. You can watch them catching salmon underwater. It's an incredible light show. As you can see in this picture, is it in focus enough for you to see the marks on this orca's back? Can you see these? I don't know if the thing's in focus. I can't tell from where I'm at. Let me see if I can adjust it. There are three stripes on that orca's saddle patch, that little white patch at the base of the fin. And thus probably a love bite, basically a small warning that its mother once gave it to basically tell it to stop doing something. It looks like it's a wound, but it's really not. If an orca wanted to really bite another orca, it would seriously wound it. This is a little bit like taking fingers and rubbing it on your skin. That's about how serious it is. Some orcas have very distinct and unique dorsal fins. They're easy to recognize, of course. When orcas spy hop, that's an old whaling term, they come up out of the water to use their eyes above water so they can see things. Their visual acuity, as far as we can tell, is very similar to our own. And in terms of all the kinds of tests that psychologists have ever run on members of the dolphin family, in terms of their learning ability, their abilities to discriminate, to learn to solve tasks, they're right there level with human beings in every test they've been put to. In this particular case, the orcas are looking for transient orcas that are moving through on the opposite side of the channel. Even though we've never seen war between orcas, it is possible that the resident orcas, the ones that eat fish only and live in the same areas year-round, these are really cultures. These are little societies. And they have different cultures, meaning that we have the transient orcas that eat marine mammals. They have a totally different lifestyle. I believe that they're not really on friendly terms, the resident orcas and the transient orcas. We haven't seen warfare between them, and I suspect, though, that it's possible. It's not to be unexpected, perhaps. There's something happened 100,000 years ago that separated these creatures. And I don't think the transients want to meet up with the local residents. And it's just possible that because they can use sonar so effectively to monitor one another, that is one of the reasons we don't observe warfare. If you can perfectly assess another individual using this equivalent of X-ray vision, it would never be necessary to actually fight because you would know the outcome of the battle. If two warriors of any species could completely assess one another, they probably would never have to fight. What we do is we puff ourselves up. We act brave and courageous when in fact we're frightened. I might walk into a bar and act like I'm a tough guy, but my heart's beating very fast. You can't see that. All you see is there's some guy that looks like he thinks he's a real stud. See, this is the problem again and the difference between being human and relying upon reflected light as opposed to being a dolphin and an orca where you can use sonar to literally look through one another. We spend a lot of time in the water with orca whales. And it has been for many people, including myself, a high-ranking spiritual experience. They're able to use sound, as you know dolphins do at the dolphin centers in Florida, in a range of ways. The dolphins are healing young people regularly at these dolphin swim centers. They also use sound to stun their prey. In a sense, they are technological creatures. A dolphin can put out a blast of sound and stun a fish 50 yards away with the intensity of the sound that it's able to emit. Now, orcas have even, of course, more potential using sound energy to stop an animal in its tracks, so to speak. And that's what they do. Sometimes orcas in New Zealand will circle around some porpoises, and they will blast them so intensively with sound energy that the porpoises are totally disoriented and unable to escape. And the orcas come in one at a time and eat 2 or 3 of them, then another one comes in until all the orcas have had their fill. So they use sound in all kinds of ways, but one of the ways they use sound with human beings is to somehow give us a precious gift, to somehow remove negative energies and open up our heart centers. We had a couple of special dogs on the Orca project. One of them was called the Orca dog, not because he was black and white, really, but because he would alert the camp to the approach of orcas. His name was Huey. He would hear them before we could hear them, and he would start barking. So we'd all run down to the shore in advance of the orca's arrival. One day, he got so excited over the orcas cornering a salmon in that little pool of water on the bottom left of that photo. The salmon had gone in there when the orcas approached, and finally one of the orcas rolled up on the rocks, chased the salmon out the other side. Then the orcas began to chase the salmon. Well, Huey got so excited by it all, he just leaped right in the water. And we immediately started thinking, well, gosh, maybe they really don't eat just fish, you know. Maybe they're going to eat our dog, see. So we got worried, but he immediately turned around, and they didn't harm him. Well, that slide didn't work, I'm sorry. And he was safe. We had some real characters on this project, including Terry, who was our French cook, and also played the flute. We tried all kinds of ways to communicate with orca whales. We played music, we sang, and sometimes singing did work off of boats, particularly, and oddly enough, when we sang that song, Naninda Hey, which I sang for you briefly yesterday. When we would make a circle on the back of a boat and sing that song, in particular, the orcas would come up to the back of the boat and listen to us. How many of you have heard of Paul Winter Consort? I made beautiful music, Common Ground, and other tracks. Paul Winter went out with some of his musicians in Puget Sound. They played the concert to orca whales. The orcas were spy hopping around their boat and listening to it. And after they played, the orcas basically played back their rendition, if you will, of the music they had just heard from the human musicians. And in fact, in some of my very first studies, I recorded sounds underwater of orcas, and I could not figure out, for the life of me, what they were doing. They didn't sound like the usual whistles and clicks that you associate with orca whales. And I was stymied. And I got to talking with a friend of mine at Smithsonian, and he said, well, you've got to imagine what they're hearing from humans when they're underwater. And so I went and made some recordings of people talking on boats. And sure enough, it was almost identical to the sounds that the orcas were making underwater. They had been hearing people talking above water. And of course, the passage of the sound through water distorts it tremendously, so I didn't recognize it. But by golly, it was a very close match. One of the first orcas to go to New York arrived there, and a friend of mine who's a real whale fan got permission from the aquarium to stay there with it all night long. And they thought that was fine because he was familiar with whales and it was an extra hand. Well, he was alone with the orca during the night. He began to whistle at one point. I don't know why, but he did, and the orca immediately began to imitate his whistling. And so they basically held a concert of whistling all night long. All those things indicate that, in fact, orcas, I think, would like to be able to communicate with us. And we tried a lot of different things, as I said. One of the things we did was broadcast music underwater. I even broadcast some of the Paul Winter music, because I thought the whales might like it too. They didn't respond much to that. One day I was out on a boat, and the orcas were passing by, and for some reason, it was totally spontaneous, and there's a secret in this, I think. I stood up in the boat, and I yelled out, "Nicola!" That was the name of the female who was leading this group. She's the friendliest orca at that time in the world. "Nicola! Nicola!" like that. Nicola left the group and swam straight to the boat. And I thought, wow, you know, I've been trying all this technological wizardry to try to get a reaction from orca whales. And finally I call one and it comes to me, see? Well, actually, she probably recognizes her name. She's heard all kinds of scientists and other people out in boats talking about her, you know, using her name, and boat holes act like amplifiers. They literally broadcast sound underwater. So she probably recognized her name. But the very fact that she would respond to me calling her is a whole other story. And so it began to change our approach to interacting with orcas. So what we did is we'd begin to get together in a group when we'd see Nicola coming, and we'd stand out on the observation post. We'd begin to yell, "Nicola," when she'd show up. Well, about 2 days after we started this, she swam right into shore, just a few feet away from our campground, our fire where we were eating. There was 10 of us, and one man who was there was a well-known journalist. And we all got very excited. We knew something was up, and she swam around then out into the open strait. We all ran up to the observation post, and then all of a sudden, quite unexpectedly, her entire pod of females and calves surfaced around her. And they were all facing shore, and they were floating there. Orcas just don't stand still very long. They're almost always moving, even when they sleep. They go through a very slow pattern of diving and rising, often in unison, perfect unison, while they sleep. In this case, they were just hanging on the surface, floating, looking in at shore at us. Well, we were jumping up and down and yelling and very excited, like a bunch of little children. Well, then the most spectacular thing in orca land that I've ever witnessed occurred. 2 cows would get on each side of a calf and bring it into shore. When they got to shore, the calf would spy hop, come straight up out of the water to look at us looking at it. And it would come up and look at us, and we'd be jumping up and down and yelling and totally excited. And this would happen, maybe it would spy hop 10 or 12 times, and then it would go down. The cows never spy hopped. They just laid on the surface on each side of the calf as it kept spy hopping and looking at us. Then they would take that calf back to the group. Then 2 more cows would bring another calf in, and the whole thing was repeated until all the calves had seen us close up. And I believe that Nicola had orchestrated, that's a pun, had orchestrated a meeting between her youngsters and a pod of friendly human beings. It's the only time we've heard about that, by the way. It's probably happened with native peoples quite a lot. In fact, there's some things that happen with Native Americans and orcas that really go off the scale. There are some people, and I've promised not to say who they are, there are some native people in British Columbia who actually give their babies, their newborn babies, over to orca whales after they're born. They put them in a little sort of canoe-like boat, and the orcas literally take the babies out to sea and bring them back. And some kind of initiation is occurring during that time. Nicola is the orca on the left with the nick in the top of her dorsal fin. That's how she got her name. Time's up. Oh no, not again. There's an orca's eye right there. I built this wonderful cabin on the water just with materials I found on the beaches, including that deck. That deck was washed up on that little tiny island you see in the back corner of the picture, all pre-made. It was like a great discovery. Imagine being Huck Finn living in the wilderness and finding your deck. Wow. I could put 20 people on that thing. That's the only life-size sculpture of an orca in the world. This man here is an engineer who was very skeptical about the things I had to say about orca whales. He brought his 2-year-old son in this project. And on this particular day, he changed his mind. All at once, a calf orca began to jump out of the water and swim straight to our boat and look right in the eyes of his 2-year-old son. And that night around the fire, he said, "Maybe you're right about these orca whales." Our little son Drake has been out in the wilderness with orca whales since he was 3.5 months old. Now, this is a horrifying picture, but I think it's important to show it. This is the end of my talk. I'm sorry I've talked long again. When the Japanese fishermen on the Iki Islands go out and round up dolphins and stab them to death with spears and turn the seas red with their blood, they're doing so because in their minds, dolphins are competing with them for fish. This is basically the attitude that got us to the level of being the dominant creature on this planet, believe it or not. We are the dominant predator of Earth. Now, when you see a picture like this, it stops you in your tracks. It might hurt you. It might shock you. But what's amazing to me as a behaviorist is that these dolphins offer no resistance whatsoever to those human beings. This has happened repeatedly. Dolphins could kill a human being. Dolphins weigh several hundred pounds. They can get to move 30 knots in a matter of seconds. They have incredible acceleration abilities in the water. But in none of these cases, this is not the only one, none of these cases did any of these dolphins charge a human being. Their children are being killed. Their brothers, their mothers, their sisters, their fathers are being killed. Not one of those dolphins ever harmed a human being. And some of those human beings are walking around out there in water this deep, up to their waist. A dolphin could grab a man's leg and bite it and break it. A dolphin could quickly charge and hit a person with that rostrum right in the gut and literally tear that human being open, the same way that they kill sharks. So I would ask you, why are these dolphins allowing these human beings to kill them with ease? Is it possible that dolphins know something about love? Something about love that we need to know? I think so. Thank you.